I trusted a colleague, and he snatched the idea of my life from my hands and began to develop it as his own, even managing to bring in an investor. Everyone around me called him a genius and me a loser, but I kept quiet and accumulated evidence so that I could one day turn the tables. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. I've always believed that hard work and the ability to see things through can break down any barrier. That's why, in my first years at the Chicago office, I stayed on longer than anyone else, delving into project details, creating spreadsheets and charts, and figuring out ideas that many considered too crude or risky. But for me, were more than just lines on a screen. I wasn't born into wealth, so every success was the result of sleepless nights, refusing to rest, and a constant feeling of having to prove I was as good as anyone, if not better. One day, when company management announced the opportunity for employees to put forward their own initiatives and pitch projects to potential investors, I saw it as the opportunity I'd been waiting for. The idea I'd been working on for months was about a new approach to automating internal processes. It was far from a glossy presentation, but I saw it as the foundation for something bigger. I started collecting rough drafts, simple diagrams, snippets of code, cost-saving calculations, forecasts I'd compiled myself at night, and gradually a coherent picture began to emerge. However, I'd always had a problem. I was poor at selling my ideas, explaining them simply so someone unfamiliar with the process could immediately see the benefits. So, when one colleague showed unexpected attention to my notes and offered to help format the materials, I didn't perceive it as a threat. On the contrary, I saw it as an opportunity to improve the presentation and make it more understandable. We often stayed after work, discussing details. He asked questions, and it seemed to me he was genuinely interested in making the idea a joint project. I trusted him and gave him access to some rough files, believing it was a necessary part of the process, not a potential trap. Over time, I noticed odd little things. He increasingly asked questions not for clarification, but rather to check my progress, stopped sharing his own thoughts, and seemed more like an observer than a co-author. At the time, I chalked it up to fatigue or workload, but an unpleasant feeling lingered. A couple of weeks later, rumors began circulating around the office that a major presentation was being prepared, and among the names mentioned behind the scenes was his name, not mine. At first, I didn't believe it, as it seemed too brazen, but as the day approached, more details emerged. He was seen behind closed doors with managers discussing the event's organization, walking with the confidence of someone who feels like the protagonist of the upcoming event. I tried to find out more directly, but his answers were evasive, and it felt as if an invisible net was being stretched around me, with me remaining merely an observer. I started checking my files and realized that some drafts had been opened in the system without my knowledge, even though access was restricted. I couldn't prove it, since I'd technically granted it permission. My insides were seething, but I knew that shouting about it right now would be making me look envious without proof, which was worse than remaining silent. Those days, I became completely convinced that my idea wasn't being publicly announced by me, but by someone who had decided that someone else's work could be their springboard to success. I lay awake nights, considering all the options, pondering what to do, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that in this situation, I'd have to act not hastily, but with composure. I began collecting everything I had: dated drafts, correspondence, screenshots with file revision histories, notes in a notebook that could be cross-checked with the electronic version. Gradually, I built a dossier that could confirm that I was the author of the idea. I felt simultaneously betrayed and cornered, but somewhere deep inside, another feeling was brewing, a fierce determination not to let him walk out on stage and receive applause for my work with impunity. Day after day, I went to the office, pretending that everything was fine, that I suspected nothing, but inside, revenge was brewing. I knew the moment would come when everything would turn against him, but for now, I had to gather my strength and prepare the ground. During that period, I first realized that revenge can be cold, calculated, and even sweet if approached correctly. And then I promised myself that when the day of the presentation came, I would be there and make sure everyone saw the truth, so that he wouldn't just lose my project but leave that room empty-handed. At that moment, when I realized my idea was already being perceived as alien, and my colleague, with a smug grin, was increasingly embracing the role of talented innovator, I had to pretend I'd resigned myself and held no grudges. I continued to smile in the hallways, greet him as if nothing had happened between us, and even tossed out a few minor suggestions about the project, as if I supported his endeavor, although inside I was seething with anger. He clearly believed I'd swallowed my anger and accepted the fact that my name wasn't mentioned anywhere else, giving me room to prepare. I began to plan my presentation so that everything would seem natural, without raising unnecessary suspicions. First, I pretended to remain interested in the project's progress and occasionally asked questions about the presentation. He liked feeling the spotlight, so he willingly shared details, unaware that he was revealing his presentation plan to me. Meanwhile, I quietly worked on our internal correspondence. I downloaded and saved all the emails that mentioned the idea and my initial suggestions to a personal drive. Even the smallest notes, seemingly unimportant at first glance, I filed away in a separate folder. I knew that at the right moment, all this could be decisive. The next step was to get closer to the presentation preparation process itself. I learned that he had been named the main speaker, but he was assisted by several employees from the marketing and visualization departments. Then I approached them, pretended to be genuinely happy for my colleague, and offered to help with the technical side, as I was the best at using presentation software. They didn't object, and so I gained access to the layouts and drafts of the final file. I didn't even have to hack anything or find workarounds. Everything was right there in front of me, and I simply copied the updates to my personal folder, creating a mirrored version of the presentation. My colleague even thanked me, saying it was great that I'd decided to pitch in and that he appreciated my professional support. I nodded and smiled, although inside I could barely contain the urge to ridicule his insolence. In the evenings, I stayed in the office longer than usual, under the pretext of improvements or tests. But in reality, I meticulously collected all the necessary evidence and refined my plan down to the last detail. I started keeping a calendar, marking key dates, board meetings, internal reports, and of course, the day of the presentation. When I realized that time was running out before the main event, I decided to add another layer of security. I emailed the investor I'd once tried to interest in this idea and invited him for coffee. I didn't reveal the whole truth in the email, but I hinted that the project, which he might soon be shown, was related to me. We met at a small cafe near the office, and I showed him my early drafts, notes with dates, and even internal correspondence. The investor carefully reviewed the materials and noticed that my authorship was indeed evident. He didn't immediately promise any action, but said he'd like to see the presentation itself if he got the chance. I didn't press the issue, just smiled and suggested that perhaps he'd have another opportunity. Returning home after this meeting, I felt everything was working out just as it should. My colleague continued to enjoy the attention from his superiors, even joking in the smoking room that he was about to go from being a simple specialist to the face of the company, and that he was already planning to move closer to the investor's headquarters. No one dared doubt his words, because some bosses literally sang his praises, believing he would bring in profits. And I stood nearby, nodding and pretending to be happy for him, even though I already knew everything would change in an instant. I continued to maintain my role as an unsung assistant, carefully tweaking files, copying versions, and nodding his every change. Sometimes I even suggested which slides to improve or how to rephrase a description, because I needed the final version to be as convincing as possible. The higher he rose, the more painful his fall would be. A couple of days before the presentation, he relaxed so much that he even invited me to come into the conference room and watch the rehearsal. I sat in my chair and watched him confidently wave his arms, describing my project as if he had conceived it himself, and I felt hatred boiling inside me. But at the same time, anticipation was growing. He didn't know that his every move, his every word, was already woven into my future revenge. Everything was shaping up perfectly, and I knew I was only one step away from the truth coming out. When I realized that simply keeping copies of emails and drafts wasn't enough to deliver a definitive and irrefutable blow, I turned my attention to the technical aspects of preparing the presentation. Our office system was set up so that presentations were held in the same conference rooms, with a shared cloud storage account and a projector that automatically synced with pre-uploaded files. I'd noticed this detail in my first weeks on the job, and at the time, it seemed like a minor detail, but now I saw it as a tool that could play a decisive role. If the system was configured correctly, any file from this storage could be displayed first on the screen when the demonstration started, even drafts that would look like raw notes, complete with my dates, edits, and comments. Only then could the presentation be switched to the desired one. In public, this would look like a random glitch, but in reality, the audience would receive the most important thing: proof that the entire idea was mine, since the drafts bore my name and timestamps, which could not be falsified retroactively. To ensure the idea was feasible, I stayed in the office several times until late in the evening and wandered the empty hallways in search of available rooms. I connected my laptop to the projector, loaded test files, created fake presentation versions, tested how the system responded when opening a document with a different name but the same extension, and gradually built a plan. It turned out the technology wasn't perfect. It left caches, automatically saved the last open documents, and could accidentally reopen them upon restart. For most, this would be a bug, but for me, it was a chance to turn a simple glitch into a tool for revenge. But for everything to go flawlessly, I needed to figure out the timing. Through contacts in the marketing department, I found out the exact schedule of the dress rehearsal and who would be responsible for the equipment on the day of the main presentation. The technician was a newbie who worked part-time and didn't understand the intricacies of the company, so the likelihood of him noticing the intrusion was minimal. All that remained was to discreetly introduce my files into the system and wait for them to present themselves to the right audience. Outwardly, I continued to play the ally. I praised my colleague, sometimes suggested minor corrections to his slides, even helped him move the props for the demonstration. He believed in my loyalty so much that he began sharing his personal concerns about the upcoming presentation. He was afraid of failure, but then he boasted that this idea will definitely work. I listened and nodded, though inside me, I felt a growing sense of impending denouement. Every word he said fueled my resolve. One night, as the office was emptying, I entered the conference room with a keycard that gave me access to almost every room. I uploaded several versions of my old files to the cloud. Drafts with handwritten notes, intermediate slides with awkward wording, tables without formatting, anything that would look too rough for a formal presentation. I deliberately left my initials in the comments, noted dates long before my colleague even started working on the project, and saved them with unobtrusive names so the technology would automatically load them first. After checking the result, I connected the projector, did a test run, and watched as the screen flickered and displayed one of my old files. I quickly closed it and launched a test presentation to make sure everything was working as usual. My heart was pounding, because this was the first time the plan had taken shape, not just remained a fantasy. I sat in the darkened room and stared at the white screen, feeling adrenaline and satisfaction mingle within me. From that moment on, there was no turning back. The next day, I returned to my usual routine. My colleague was once again telling everyone about his successes. His bosses were smiling at him in the hallways, and he felt triumphant even before the presentation. No one but me could see that this entire edifice of confidence was built on sand. I pretended to be concerned for him, offered to help with the final edits, and thereby gained access to the final version of the presentation. I copied it and added it to my collection of evidence, so that if anything happened, I would have a complete set, from rough ideas to the finished product. That evening, I checked the files in the cloud again and confirmed that my drafts were still there. I even deliberately changed the opening time of one of the documents so it would appear that it had been recently edited from my account. This was meant to cement the connection between me and the project. With each passing day leading up to the presentation, the tension grew, but so did my sense of control. I watched my colleague become increasingly complacent, making plans for bonuses and career advancement, and I understood that this very arrogance would play into his hands in my game. He hadn't left himself any escape hatches, and when the truth came out, he would have no excuses or recourse. Everything was unfolding exactly as I had planned, and all that remained was to wait for the day when the room would fill with executives, investors, and colleagues, and the screen would show something completely different from what he had so carefully prepared. That morning began as usual, but from the very first minutes, I sensed that something would go wrong. I arrived at the office a little earlier than usual to double-check my bookmarks, system, and files, because I was just one step away from the moment I'd been waiting for all these months. But that's when everything changed. While I was sipping coffee at my desk and checking my email, a notification arrived from my secretary that the investor, whom I'd already met informally, was coming to the office today, right before the main presentation, to assess current progress and the team atmosphere. The wording sounded vague, but I immediately realized he wanted to attend a dress rehearsal. At first, I froze. The plan, designed for the final presentation, could backfire prematurely. Several thoughts raced through my head. What if the files opened too early? What if a colleague suspected interference? What if the investor saw too much right now? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't a threat, but an opportunity. If the system works even in a trial run, it will serve as proof to the investor that I am the one with control and the primary sources. Moreover, I will have the opportunity to observe my colleague's reaction when he first feels the ground begin to crack under his feet. The office came alive faster than usual. Everyone was rushing around with printouts, setting up projectors, lugging bottles of water to the room where the whole thing was to take place. The executives looked tense, but pretended to be in control. And my colleague, the thief, was practically beaming. He walked down the hallway in a perfectly pressed suit, smiling like a Hollywood star on the red carpet, and happily accepted compliments. After all, everyone thought he was the one who came up with the idea that a serious, well-heeled person would be arriving today to support. I stuck close by, helped connect cables, played the loyal assistant, and every time he glanced in my direction, I pretended to support him. Inside, I was seething, but I maintained a calm facade because that was my trump card. He had to believe everything was under control, even though I was. When the investor entered the building, the atmosphere changed. Everyone seemed to freeze. Employees hid their phones, stood up hastily, some even straightened their ties. He was greeted with smiles and handshakes, but he, just like last time, looked focused and cool. He didn't waste words, simply nodded to the executives and asked to see how the preparations were going. He was seated in the front row, directly in front of the screen, and the tension in the room became almost physical. My colleague looked confident, holding the slide controller as if it were the key to a new life, and began his presentation. He spoke loudly, emphasized his points, paused, and looked people straight in the eye. The executives nodded. The employees whispered among themselves about how much he'd improved his public speaking skills. And everything was going perfectly until he switched to the next slide. At that moment, the screen flickered, and instead of graphs and pretty charts, a document window with my notes appeared. There were lines like rework the segment idea, emphasize platform flexibility, dates that predated the team's official start date, and most importantly, my initials. Silence fell over the room instantly. No one moved, coughed, or even whispered. Only the screen's light reflected off their faces. A colleague blinked, tried to quickly click on the next slide, and the pretty charts reappeared, but the moment had already happened. I saw the investor raise an eyebrow slightly and open his notepad. He didn't say a word, but he began making notes, and that was enough to fill me with a feeling of triumph. My colleague pretended nothing had happened and continued speaking, but his voice had grown thinner, trembled slightly, and his gestures had lost their confidence. To most of the audience, it looked like a simple technical glitch, but the investor clearly understood more. He glanced in my direction, and I realized he recognized the familiar drafts. My colleague tried to keep the audience's attention, but I could see the sweat trickling down his temples and his grip on the remote so tightly that his fingers were white. The executives exchanged glances but didn't intervene. One of them only asked afterward, "What was that window?" And then the real spectacle began. My colleague laughed, clearly forced, and said something like, "An old file accidentally got into the system. We haven't used it for a long time." But the investor, smiling reservedly, noted that he would like to see the development history and intermediate versions later. in order to understand the entire path from the idea to the result. It sounded gentle, but it was a blow. I saw my colleague momentarily speechless, then start nodding again and assuring me that everything would be possible to show, but his confidence was already crumbling. After the rehearsal, the room emptied, the employees went off to discuss what had happened, and my colleague approached me with a look of anger and fear mixed on his face. He mentioned that everything needs to be retested to prevent similar failures, and I nodded solemnly, promising to help. But inside, I was jubilant. Now, for the first time, he realized that not everything was going according to plan, and I had confirmation. The investor had become suspicious, and now it was only a matter of time before the whole structure would finally collapse. The closer the day of the real presentation got, the more nervous he became. He checked the files several times, asked the technical team to double-check the system, but I knew no check would save him. I had embedded the trap too deeply. The week leading up to the main presentation stretched on for an eternity, even though every day was jam-packed with activities. The office was filled with anticipation, as if we were preparing not for a work event but for a Broadway performance, where not only money but also the entire company's reputation was at stake. Management was running around with important people, marketing was preparing promotional materials, and all of this was presented under the pretense that my colleague was the star of the upcoming show. His name was featured in internal emails, his photo was included in presentation brochures for potential partners, and many in the office were eyeing him as the future vice president of the department. He basked in the attention, but I saw something else. With each passing day, the confidence he had previously brandished was becoming more and more feigned. After that random glitch at rehearsal, he couldn't quite relax, and while everyone else dismissed it as a minor issue, I noticed him lingering in the office every evening, checking the system down to the last detail. Sometimes, I'd deliberately pass by the conference room and see him sitting in front of the screen, flicking slides back and forth, as if trying to make sure nothing else would pop up. He even started carrying an external hard drive around with him, as if he were afraid of losing control of the files. To others, this looked like dedication, but to me, it was a clear sign of fear. I continued to play the reliable assistant. When he asked me to connect a cable, reboot the projector, or check the sound, I did so without a hint of malice, and he gradually began to believe the glitch was truly an accident. Meanwhile, I added more layers to my trap. It was meant to look like the system itself was occasionally acting out, when in fact, it was a carefully calculated intervention. The more he tested and found no problems, the more relaxed he became, and the more painful his fall would be when the time came. Management held increasingly frequent meetings, discussing not only the idea itself, but also how it would be presented. One director even said that this will be a historic day for the company, and I saw a colleague straighten his shoulders at these words. He was held above everyone else, even those who had worked on other projects for years. Some employees quietly whispered in the smoking room that they were predicting a rapid career advancement for him, and he clearly believed it himself. I remained silent and listened, understanding that the higher they elevated him, the more dramatic his fall would be. The investor, meanwhile, kept a low profile. After that rehearsal, he didn't comment directly, but in a conversation with the management, he hinted that he wanted to see the full picture of the process. He sounded calm, but I saw interest in his eyes, and this interest was not directed at my colleague. I knew he'd noticed the similarities between the drafts he'd seen and the file he'd accidentally found. I'd seen him look at me during rehearsal and knew he was waiting for me to make my move. But I deliberately remained in the shadows, because the blow wasn't meant to be quiet, but public and devastating. The entire office was anticipating the day of the presentation, discussing details like what appetizers would be at the reception and what music would play beforehand. For the others, it was almost a celebration, but for me, it was an arena where the truth would finally be revealed. My colleague was growing increasingly nervous, but he knew how to hide it behind a mask. He practiced in conference rooms, even rehearsed his speech in the cafeteria, and had interns act as the audience. His voice grew louder, his movements more theatrical, clearly preparing himself for a standing ovation. But the more he rehearsed, the more uncertainty I saw in his eyes. He remembered that the system had already shown something no one expected, and he understood that it could happen again. He was afraid, but he had no choice. He had come too far to back out. 2 days before the event, I deliberately stayed late and pretended to run into him in the conference room. He was sitting at his laptop, checking a presentation, and when I walked in, he quickly closed several windows, as if he didn't want me to see. He muttered something about just double-checking, and I offered my help with all sincerity. He agreed, and I showed him how to optimize the file order to avoid any confusion. In reality, I'd only hid my trap even deeper, so now he had absolutely no chance of escape. As I left, he looked a little calmer, but I could tell he was still wide awake. His steps were abrupt, his eyes red, and he kept the slight advance remote close to him, as if it were a talisman. The office was alive with anticipation. My colleague was alive with fear, and I was alive with anticipation. Everything was moving toward the point where, on the day of the presentation, I would witness not just the fall of the man who stole my idea, but a spectacle no one present would ever forget. On the day of the final presentation, the air in the office was tense, and every step echoed in my chest, as if the building itself knew something more than just a project demo would take place today. I walked calmly, but inside me, the energy of months of sleepless nights, resentments, and meticulous preparation was seething. My colleague was beaming, moving around the room with a confident smile, greeting the investor, exchanging words with management, and in every gesture I could sense that he already considered himself a winner. For him, this was a day of triumph. For me, a moment of truth. The room was packed. In addition to the investor, there were representatives of partner companies, and even a few reporters invited by the PR department to add scale to the event. My colleague began his speech confidently, showed beautiful slides, discussed the prospects, and it seemed the audience was ready to give him a standing ovation. But I sat in the center of the room, waiting for the moment for which I had thought through everything down to the last detail. As he moved on to the key diagrams, the screen suddenly flickered, and instead of the brightly colored graph, a window opened with a document archive. My drafts, complete with dates, notes, and handwriting, written on those very nights when I was alone in the empty office, flashed by. For a moment, everyone thought it was a glitch, but when the page with my comments and highlighted issues opened, a murmur erupted in the room. The executives straightened, the investor leaned forward slightly, and a colleague visibly paled and rushed to the console, trying to close the window. But the system was set up so that the first file opened a second, then a third, and there was no escape on the screen. Everyone was watching in real time how the idea was born, how I built its foundation step by step, how the blocks of the future presentation were formed. Panicked, my colleague began to say that these were team-working materials, but his voice trembled, and everyone in the room heard the falsehood. Someone whispered, "I saw those drafts on his desk," and that phrase, coming from someone else's lips, was the beginning of the end. The investor calmly stood up and asked the technician to stop the presentation, not to save his colleague, but to allow me to connect my laptop. When my folder with the document chronology, metadata, and correspondence appeared on the screen, the room fell into an icy silence, every word cutting through the ear. I showed the emails where I shared my ideas, noting the upload dates, and the investor emphasized that he had already reviewed these materials in advance. At that moment, my colleague's facade crumbled. He was no longer a confident speaker. His hands were shaking, his forehead was covered in sweat, and his gaze darted around the room, searching for a single, allied pair of eyes. But even his closest friends from the marketing department averted their gaze, afraid of being associated with him. The head of the company, the man who had hailed him as the future leader that morning, now sat stone-faced and silent, as if he had been personally betrayed. The room erupted into chaos. Some were whispering, others were looking at me with questions, and still others were filming everything on their phones, realizing they had witnessed a scandal. A colleague tried to shout that it was a setup, that I was deliberately setting a trap, but his words sounded pathetic and empty, as the facts were too obvious. When the investor took the floor again, he calmly and confidently declared that he was only willing to continue negotiations with the project's true author, his gaze fixed on me. The room erupted in noise, people turned around, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of my truth become undeniable. My colleague sank into his chair as if the bones had been ripped from his body, his back arched, his eyes filled with panic and humiliation. And in that moment I realized, this was it, the very revenge I had been fighting for, not a scream, not a scandal, but the cold, public destruction of someone else's lies. After the presentation, an internal investigation began, and he was summoned to a private office, but his excuses were already meaningless. Documents, correspondence, dates, everything pointed to him simply stealing my work. A week later, he was suspended from all projects, and a few days later, fired for loss of trust. His name was no longer mentioned at meetings, his profile on the corporate intranet disappeared, and around the office he was whispered about as a warning. I, however, found myself the center of attention. Executives began treating me as a key contributor, an investor offered a contract, and colleagues who had previously indifferently overlooked my late-night efforts now brought reports for review and sought my approval. I received not only the project and resources, but also the respect that words alone can't buy. But the most valuable thing wasn't that. It was the expression on the face of someone who had once enjoyed my work. His pride turned to ashes right before my eyes, and that was the very thing I'd been striving for. I expected euphoria, but instead I felt a weight. Revenge was sweet, but there was also bitterness in it, because behind my triumph lay the emptiness of someone else's broken fate. And yet I knew, if I hadn't done this, I would have been trampled completely. This story became more than just retribution for me, but proof that even in a world where thieves often get away with it, you can make a plan and wait for the moment when the truth breaks through all the walls.